two really interesting recording in progress. Two really interesting talks today. We will have time for questions after each talk. So if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat, and we can present them to our speakers after their presentations. So we've got today Luana Scrivano, who's a clinical psychologist, a PhD candidate at the University of Bologna, and also a visiting researcher at the University of Manchester. Her research is focusing on relationship between active mobility, so walking and cycling for transportation, and mental health, and exploring how engaging in active mobility can improve mental health outcomes alongside its established physical health benefits. And she'll be presenting on active mobility and mental health, a scoping review towards a healthier and greener world. And following Luana, we'll have Dr. Christopher Walsh, who is a postdoc at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change and Research at the University of Manchester. And Chris has a background in climate modelling, with a particular focus on agriculture and political implications. His previous works focused on building governance frameworks for sustainable bioengineering developments in Malawi. And he's particularly interested in the science policy interface and implications for sustainable development in the global south. And his talk will be titled Creating Momentum for Climate Action in Devolved Governments. So I think people are joining now. So without any further ado, I hand over to Luana. Do you want to start our first talk, please? Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Steve, for the introduction and the presentation. So I will share my screen now, hopefully managing easily. And yes, here is my presentation. Okay. All right, there you go. Okay, can you see my screen all good?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, because I'm, as you know, I'll only be able to see the screen. Anyway, so good afternoon, everyone, once again. My name is Luana Scrivano, and as Steve said, I am a mental health researcher. And I work with lifestyle habits. One of these is definitely the way we transport, the way we move. And this was the co-foundation of my PhD project, the relationship between active mobility and mental health. So when I started my PhD, I knew very little about active mobility. And I thought, well, first off, let's see what's already known about active mobility and mental health. The only thing I knew was that active mobility, also called with many other names, as we will see, was meant, it means moving from point A to point B, using our energies, using some form of physical activity. And obviously you can imagine the most common ones are definitely walking and cycling. So no leisure time physical activity, no walking after lunch to digest, no, I don't know, dancing to reduce the stress, no cycling to record my sport performance. That's all not active mobility. But for example, cycling to go from, I don't know, to go and buy some groceries, that is active mobility, or traveling from home to work, that is active mobility by foot, for example. So when I started my PhD, I had some research questions, which I want to share with you. First of all, I wanted to understand what active mobility is, if it is an healthy choice, on what level it is an healthy choice, physically or also mentally. What are, if any, the benefits of active mobility for people's mental health? and what methodologies have already been used in research to, again, investigate the relationship between active mobility and mental health. And so find out if there was, what were the gaps in research, because there's always, there's always going to be a gap in research, but I needed to structure my further work for the PhD. So I needed to know what was already known and in detail. The objective, the overall objective, was to provide the reader, or in that case myself, with a broader, clear, comprehensive picture of what is known about the relationship between active mobility and mental health. So I feel like both research questions and research objective are very well structured, thought, but I wasn't ready for what I was going to find out, what I was actually going to find out in the literature. And that's why I then changed the nature of this work, because initially this was supposed to be a systematic review and potentially even a meta-analysis work. But then once I actually encountered all those studies and literature, I found myself with such a complex situation and rainbow of terminologies, methodologies, populations, so on and so forth, that it was not possible and not even valid to actually do neither a systematic review nor a meta-analysis. So I searched further and I decided to change it into a scoping review. And apparently, it looks like it's a common thing, a common theme that research that involves topics like mental health are very mixed, let's say. And that often happens because, especially, for example, in interdisciplinary situations like this one, studies come from fields like economy, urban planning, infrastructures, and they don't actually consult a mental health expert or a psychologist, a psychology researcher to then plan the study properly, let's say. So, but remember that my scope was to create the most comprehensive picture of the relationship between active mobility and mental health. So as you can see, my eligibility criteria didn't really help because they were quite broad. I wanted to see all the studies that had been done involving active mobility and any mental health outcomes. So to try and tidy up all of the results, all of the materials found, I structured, me and my supervisor, we structured this data extraction table. So after a thorough search, we concluded with 55 studies. There was no time limit, so I looked up for any research which included mental health outcomes. And so we found out that actually the majority of the studies were used cross-sectional designs because the data were actually from public health service, national service. And so once you have those that many data available, you can use a cross-sectional type of analysis to have a clear picture of the situation in that specific moment. Only 9 studies were longitudinal, and only 1 was a non-randomized controlled trial, and 4 RCTs. In my opinion, the most interesting aspect was that the oldest was the, let's say, study design non-evolution, because the oldest study, which was 25 years ago now, employed a randomized controlled trial design, which means an experimental type of study with an intervention and test if the intervention worked, etc. Whilst the most recent study actually employed cross-sectional type of analysis. And so although there was no evolution in terms of study design, we actually noticed that there was some sort of development in terms of mental health outcomes. In fact, in the past, the studies, experimental, cross-sectional, any kind, mainly focused on umbrella terms like mental health, mental well-being, quality of life, whilst with the time going, researchers kind of focused on narrower aspects of mental health. Actually, they also created, the terms travel satisfaction was also created to specifically refer to that feeling of satisfaction that the traveler perceives during his trip, which can be any kind of trip with any kind of transportation means. But again, the outcome travel satisfaction is actually connected with the traveler's mental health. And then, yes, there were some very interesting aspects because even active mobility wasn't that clearly defined. So, for example, there were some studies with older populations that were that were using the word active mobility, but actually referring to something completely different, like an outdoor walk, which it's absolutely sure that benefits people's mental health on many aspects. So the key findings of this very thorough research in terms of mental health was that, again, pretty much what I have already said, mental health, quality of life and affect, which refers to how the person feels, the daily mood, let's say, were the ones that have received the most attention by researchers. Together with the self-perceived health or self-reported health, are also the most promising ones in terms of positive relationship with the active mobility. However, it's important to consider that those are pretty much, again, umbrella terms, which means that it's not, we can't be 100% sure that with a cross-sectional design, such a big samples like the ones coming from National Health Services, and such a broader definition of mental health, we don't really know if that is actually a picture of the reality, because if all I ask to my participants is, how do you rate your mental health? That could be so broad. And we know as researchers, as mental health researchers, that likely loads of people are not even completely aware of what their mental health is and how to deal with it. Anyway, the positive side was that even smaller, let's say, outcomes, more narrower outcomes like travel satisfaction, life satisfaction, stress, loneliness, social support, and self-efficacy showed promising results. But again, there was like one study about loneliness, one study in the entire literature since the beginning of science. So you can see how it wouldn't be fair for me to say that active mobility benefits, for example, people reducing their feelings of loneliness. And then there are some mental health outcomes that have completely been ignored, like self-esteem and resilience. Trying to have a clear picture, which was the main goal of this research, we organized our results into visual aids. One of these was this word cloud, where the A section, the A image, shows the two most commonly used words, expressions in these studies for what we considered outcomes. So again, mental health outcomes. On the other side, there were the covariates. So we selected those words that were categorized as covariates that could mediate or moderate the relationship between active mobility and mental health. And it's very interesting because you can see that on the A side, that reflects pretty much our results. Mental health, quality of life, well-being are big. On the other side, if you look at the image B, public transport is massive. However, it was really hard to actually find a place for public transport because many of these studies, but not all, just simply consider public transport as part of my trip when I walk, but some others does not. So even this was, again, a confirmation that the literature is a little bit mixed and needs to be cleared out. Then we reported our results on a word map, and it's easy to see that other than some studies in Brazil and some in China, pretty much all this literature comes from public health services in English-speaking words and Europe. And finally, again, to have a very immediate picture of these results, we created this 4 quadrants albatross plot, just because the mental health outcomes were 17, so quite a lot, and we needed to split to have a better perspective. As we can see, though, the good news is that, as we can see, all the outcomes, all the studies tend to go on the right-hand side, which means that active mobility seems to have quite a positive or moderately positive relationship with mental health. There was only one study, Gomez, that actually showed a large disbenefit where walking for transportation was negatively associated with mental health and mental well-being. So yeah, these were our research questions. Let's see how we can sum them up. So active mobility is actually called in many different ways, but the common ground is that it is a way to get from one place to another using physical activity modes. Is it an healthy choice, active mobility? Physically, no doubt. We have plenty of literature showing that active mobility is an healthy choice for our physical health. Mentally, we can't say yet, because some studies have found that the duration, the transportation mode, the environment, and even individual characteristics like gender and age impact on the possibility, let's say, that active mobility can benefit mental health. In terms of mental health benefits, we found that the strongest relationship with active mobility is, again, mental health, quality of life, and well-being. And finally, the methodologies used are quite mixed and predominantly cross-sectionals. But the good news is that, well, yes, it was a bit overwhelming, but definitely good news is that research is recent, mixed, and definitely filled with gaps that gave me the opportunity to build my next work, my further research studies during my PhD based on this one. So the main future perspective that came out of this study is that we need first and foremost a unified methodological framework that can help us get results that we can actually generalize, and also that can guide researchers to structure their studies on active mobility and mental health kind of in a standardized way, because that is what science at the end of the day is about, having a standardized methodology that we can apply into different situations with different populations and get some results that we can then elaborate. Also because the ultimate goal is to inform people to develop a healthier and more active lifestyle, to inform policymakers to change how our society works so that we can actually do some active mobility. During one of the presentations, I received one question, for example, oh, I see there is a typo in this slide. But anyway, this colleague asked me about, like, yeah, but what if I don't have the time to walk to work because it's just too long and I should, I don't know, leave home very early in the morning. So that's what we need to do. We need to change definitely we need to promote a change, not just into our lifestyles, but also into the bigger picture, which regards, once again, urban planning, infrastructures, the way that our cities are built, and so on. This is, if you have your phone handy, which I'm pretty sure you do, this is the work that I presented to you today, which was published in Global Mental Health by Cambridge Press. And that was the graphical abstract, but you can find it through the postcode, through the QR code. And finally, these are my contacts. On the left-hand side, you can see my Instagram page called Luana Empowerment, because again, I work with lifestyles and I like to define myself as an empowerment advocate. There is also my LinkedIn account, and I am very grateful not just to Alexandra and Steve and Sustainable Futures for inviting me, but also for all of you to join in today. So many people. Thank you so much, and now I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Luana. That was really, really interesting. As mentioned before, it's an area I've definitely got a lot of interest personally in. So if anyone's got any questions, do post them in the chat. But I do have a couple of questions myself. I wonder if you expect to see anything around lockdowns and changes in behaviour, because there's a lot of talk about whether people are using more active travel, maybe, or more biking and walking for recreation, at least during lockdown. And obviously we had it's a huge, really difficult time psychologically for a lot of people as well. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that and if you expect to see any of that come out in your data.
Yeah. So actually, what I did after this review, I know, because I'm Italian, I come from Italy. Italy is my home country, and I noticed that of all those studies that I had found with national health services, none was ever been done had done in Italy. And so I thought, why don't we do that? We do have our health national services surveys. And so I contacted the people from the National Health Institute in Italy, and one of the first things that they told me was just be aware that data because we analyzed the data between 2021 and 2022, and they told me, yeah, just be aware that the data are very different from what we found just 1 year earlier than that, because that was the main lockdown time. 2020, 2021, 2020, 2019. And so, yes, absolutely. I expect to find different data, different situation, if the studies would have been done during COVID lockdown, or if we would even retrospectively ask people to recall what they did or how they felt, both in terms of active mobility and mental health, because people were definitely more prone to get out, to go out, to have a walk, and yes, I feel that I think that lockdown definitely changed our perspectives, but it wasn't, it didn't last that much, let's say.
It's really interesting. So this is a question from Drui, I think it's in the chat. It says, amazing project and has great implications for policy and public health. They just wanted to know how you did the word cloud. If they want to use it for their master's results section.
Oh, just through an online software, really. Yeah. So, well, if you don't mean in terms of what software we used, but how we just literally manually copied and pasted all the studies that we found, all the 55 studies, and then we asked the software to select the 2 most occurrent word expressions that was coming, and then manually, once again, we categorized the 500 most recurring words into outcomes and covariates based obviously on what we had found in the literature. So yeah, and thank you so much for finding this interesting, Drew. It was a process that I thought that would have been the first step in my PhD project, which meant like, I don't know, the first 3 to 6 months. But I actually finished the review in February 2023, so 1 year later, and that was then published in November 2023. So it was actually a work that required loads of time, time consuming, but also so necessary. I do not regret doing it. I think it was very important to kind of put it all together and see where we're at once again so that we can move on with that.
Brilliant, thank you. And probably a last question before we go over to Chris, but I'm a geographer by background, so I've got to ask this. Do you expect to see any difference in countries? There's so many different attitudes to active travel, say even across Europe.
Yeah.
So I'd see your thoughts on that and what we expect to see.
Yeah. No, that is a brilliant question. Absolutely. And it's actually, you could already see it in the literature if you general go and look at the review. Obviously there are way more details in there, so we also kind of talk a little bit of the geographical about the geographical differences, and there is absolutely no doubt also in terms of yeah, exactly. As you said, culture, because, for example, in some studies in South America, they asked the people to match transport mode with a label, and the labels were referred to people's feelings, let's say, and mood. So, for example, there was enjoyment or luxurious or poor, and so on and so forth. And we could see that, for example, in these countries, people would associate active mobility as a choice that individuals in lower society, in lower socio-demographic and economic levels would do. So if you move by active transport, it's because you can't afford you can't afford a car, you can't afford an insurance for your car, and you can't afford to pay for the fuel. And so actually that there, if I travel by foot or by bike or public transport, yeah, I'm not so happy about it, because that means that I'm not having a good life, let's say, on other types of, on other levels of my life. But in other countries, say, for example, the Netherlands, that is completely different, the situation. And so, yeah, geographically, and that is also why we need, I think, to go deeper with this topic, because it's important to understand where the differences stand and what we can do about that. Because active mobility is good for the person and for the planet everywhere in the globe, but as anything, I would say, each country needs its own type and version.
That's brilliant. So thank you very much. Thank you for your talk and all your answers and the questions. Yep. So if we can hand over to Chris now for the second talk.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. While I get this up, I'll just introduce myself a little bit more. So as Stephen said, my name is Chris Walsh. I'm a postdoc. Can you now see that? Is that what worked?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. My name's Chris Walsh. I'm a postdoc in the Tyndall Centre in Manchester. We're up in the engineering building in the big black new one. And we're generally a group of researchers who are all kind of interdisciplinary, so engineers, social scientists, and we all are brought together by an interest in taking what we know about climate change and creating impact and change in some way or form within that. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is work that's been done in Tyndall, but also in conjunction with the CAST Centre, which is another group of more social science-based researchers across the UK, which is the Centre for Climate and Social Transformations. And this has been going on for just over 5 years. And it is built on kind of initial relationships, which is something I'll go into a little bit later. I'm going to talk a little bit about, going to start by talking a little bit about devolution and why it's important and why it's particularly important in the realm of climate and our thinking about how we can create climate impacts. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project came to be and a little bit about how we've worn both our hats as academics, but also as kind of people who work within governance and with people within the local government sphere. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we found out about local government and how climate action comes to take place and how we can potentially make it happen quicker, because that's what we would all really, really like. So devolution in the UK, I think there's a broad acknowledgement now that climate action, to have the significant reach of that action, it needs to be across all scales of government, from national government impacts all the way down to local governments. Increasingly, also in the UK, we've seen local leaders, whether that be Sadiq Khan talking about air quality, he had a book out last year about air quality, or whether that be Andy Burnham in Manchester and his yearly green summits that he's been running for, I think, again, about 5-6 years now. Local leaders are increasingly becoming a face of climate, particularly during the last government, who were potentially less radical than the local leaders were. But even now they exist often as a innovating force, at least seemingly pushing the agenda forward. The UK is also currently in the process of expanding its devolution powers and expanding the powers that are given to local governments. So in last year in December, we had a new white paper come out on subject to devolution, and in her forward to that, Angela Rayner said, what we're looking for is a permanent shift of power away from Whitehall to create an efficient and accountable local and regional government with local champions who understand their local places, their identities and strengths, and how to harness them. And I think we can all agree when it comes to climate change and tackling individual problems of places across the UK, actually that local perspective is really important in that. That's kind of what this work all stems out of. So why is now important for this climate action? The first thing to say is there has been that growing self-awareness. I've talked about the leadership, but also in the councils and the functions beyond that, we've seen a large number of declarations of climate emergencies, and also a massive increase in numbers of councils who have their own net zero targets. So I think the number went up to, I don't know if you remember since we talked about during lockdown, the spate of climate emergency announcements that seemed to go off across the UK. But I think that got up to about 78-80% of councils across the UK announced as a climate emergency. And 132 councils across the UK now have a net zero target for 2030 or sooner. On the other side as well, that relationship, as I mentioned, between devolved powers and central government is in a real moment of flux, and that is even more apparent in places like Manchester and the West Midlands, where what are called trailblazer deals, which are new deals that combined authorities can have with governments, are going to massively change how the funding funding system works and the range of activities that those authorities can take. In effect, in Manchester, what this means, and in the GMCA, they're calling it the GMCA 2.0, it means that all the controlled funding that they were given for very specific targets is being given to them in one full pot. So in effect, the single settlement will be worth about 750 odd million pounds that Manchester will be given to undertake all the actions that they, as a combined authority, want to undertake. And then the ultimate thing is those net zero targets for 2030 are very, very rapidly coming due. That's only a 5-year window. We haven't yet found a council or local authority that is making any real significant progress towards that. And so that either means we're going to see a spate of councils abandoning their climate emergency and net zero targets, elongating them, or offsetting them, which we may all have our own individual opinions about how effective that approach might be. So what did we do as a group? So what we've been doing is we've been working with and alongside working groups in each of these combined authorities and councils. So we have been both responsive to their needs as well as responsive to our needs. So the process that we've gone through to create tools and to create governance approaches with those councils has been a real sort of co-development process. And out of that, and out of the delivery of those tools that I'll talk about a little bit later, we've then been able to use that to go into our own research of interest. So whether that's through interviews with senior leadership, with regular council officers, whether that's through analysis of the tools themselves and the outputs that we get out of those, that's then allowed us to get this really good insight into the inner workings of a large organization who is making quite big changes, and see how that's trickling down to the individual people working at said organization. And so I've kind of mentioned in passing the partnerships that we've done, but as I say, this work stemmed from the GMCA. Tyndall have worked with the GMCA for quite some time, whether that be through designing their carbon budget, which you might have seen talked about in the news, or more recently, this came in the form of developing a tool for them to be able to record and analyze the amount of carbon and climate that was involved in their decision making. I'll talk a little bit more about the tool later, but the broad approach that we used and were directed by the council to use is a kind of co-benefits approach. So thinking about all the areas of impact that climate and carbon have across their work, and being able to then build those into the tool as well to bring climate along with it. That work was kind of expanded about 2.5 years ago, working with Welsh local authorities, initially with Flintshire Council, but then that has since expanded to the Welsh Local Government Association, particularly then focused in on the health aspects, because in Wales they have a statutory responsibility towards health, and also towards the Welsh language, so building those things into our co-benefits framework. And then also with the GLA, which is the Greater London Authority, where we particularly built it around their reform process they were going through at the time of their new equalities impact assessment. And the really important thing with all three of these, as I think you can hopefully tell and is coming through, is that we were able to hang climate and carbon off of statutory responsibilities that the council had. So without carbon and climate action itself being a statutory responsibility, the effort that we put in through the tool is to hang it on things that they have to do. In London, for instance, they have to do the EQI assessment for every decision that they're making and every financial proposal that they're going through. So if they have to do the EQIA assessment, and that is based in this carbon tool, they then have to also do the carbon, and it brings it through with it. And then since that has also expanded us creating an online tool, which is available online for any local authority to take up. And I can't remember at last count what it was, but we've had, I think, 70 70 odd come through that, and have recently been working with some of the new combined authorities as well around the country, like South Yorkshire and other councils as well, to see what we can do to make it work better for them. So what is this tool that I'm talking about? Here's a couple of snippets of the online version. As I've said, the tool is based around those kind of co-benefit areas. So the first section of the tool that we give people to do is is based around those impact areas, and that's entirely self-assessed. So that is based around equalities, as I mentioned, health, resilience and adaptation, housing, economy, mobility and connectivity, the environment, and consumption and production. So in that section, we ask people to grade the impact of their decisions on particular criteria. So, for instance, how will this positively or negatively impact homelessness, for instance, in the inequalities section? And we ask them to rank their level of impact on a scale for that, both positively and negatively. And based on their responses to that first section, we'll then move them across to a carbon assessment, particularly formed around the buildings and transport and resilience sections and land use sections of that, which at that point is self-reported, so that their answers are analysed against our kind of scientific understanding of what carbon action would mean and graded on that, as a hook to more thoroughly interrogate what they're actually doing. So everything is scored within the tool, and at the end that is taken out and you get a results page, and that's designed to be attached then to the decision form, and that's how it works in both Manchester and London. This is now a part of their decision-making proposal process, which is available online for every decision they make. So this first section, this is for the self-assess section, is scored from green to dark red. We're very keen within the tool that negatives will happen. That's the reality of working in any space, that there will be trade-offs. And so I don't think we should be, we try and push out that you shouldn't be afraid of the reds. Whether or not that happens is another question. And that's why in the carbon assessment side, we've very deliberately made it not necessarily red and green. But again, it spits out at the end a results page, which allows for a quick analysis of the decision, and also gives space for justifications for those trade-offs, to provide better understanding to the decision makers who then make that decision. So from that work, we were able to interview, I think over the course of the years, over 100, a fair few, probably more than that actually, different officers and decision makers and leadership people within the councils. And so the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk first about the kind of barriers that we found to the climate action. So these tools have now been adopted by those organisations, and we did interviews before they were adopted, while they were being adopted in that testing process, and now we're doing interviews after they've been adopted to evaluate how they are working. And at the same time, we've also analysed the tools that we're getting back to see what level of impact they've made and how people are filling them in. So in terms of some of the barriers that we're seeing, I think I'd talk about first, the capacity for climate change action in both organisations is limited by a knowledge base. Because environment and climate action is often not a statutory responsibility, there is a limited access to that knowledge. Training can't be mandatory. Training is often voluntary, and so at training sessions, anecdotally, you're seeing the same people again and again. Secondly, as I said, internal expertise and collaboration, literacy levels are very, very variable, and that actually has resulted in over-reliance on a few knowledgeable individuals. So going through the list of tools, you see the same names picking up and up again, and that's created a really uneven distribution of that between departments. So you'll see some departments who excel in this and who are really taking obvious positive steps, and others which are struggling with the tool, struggling with the language. Ideally, embedding the environmental team across would be a fantastic way to start moving this forward. And the third challenge was about translating their overall strategies into action. Things like this tool are great, but what this tool doesn't do is set out a pathway from how you get to, we want to be net zero in 2030 to 2030. We found that in none of the organisations we were interviewing, there is a realistic plan that can take each individual department and each officer from where they are now to a place in 2030 where their emissions are zero and the decisions they're making are zero. So how do we create that momentum in organisations? We have, this is from one of our latest papers that will be published shortly. We've kind of recommended 6 key areas for creating momentum within local authorities and combined authorities in the UK. So the first one is about translating your broad goals into actionable policies. There's a big gap in the middle where you have people on the bottom working hard and doing these tools and thinking about these issues, and you have the big target on top, but there's no real connection between those, and there's no real obvious steps to get between them as yet. The second is about integrating co-benefits. I've already mentioned the bonus of co-benefits, bringing carbon as tagging along carbon to create a kind of quasi-statutory function for it. But actually those co-benefits also increase the viability of projects that include carbon by making, particularly on an economic basis, but also on a resilience and mitigation basis, we're starting to think about how carbon is embedded within each of those areas I talked about really deeply, and will be into the future as well. Third is about utilising the external influence. There was often within councils a refusal to acknowledge the amount of influence they have on their partners and on the organisations who come to them for money. The reality of a lot of the work that our local authorities and combined authorities do is they are paying, or they are creating funding opportunities for people to come and do specific pieces of work. So actually they do have quite a lot of power within that dynamic that they could be using, and we should encourage them to do so as well. The fourth one is to really focus on building organisational capacity around these issues. We've suggested a few particular ways to do this to the organisations we've been working on, but some of those are training, some of those are ensuring tools like this are part of the entry process into jobs, and also creating an environment team that exists across the organisation. 5 is improving their oversight and accountability on these issues. One of the big problems with tools like this is if no one's at the other end of the tool checking it, you can get into a situation where people aren't filling the tool in properly, or where people aren't filling the tool in at all. One of the key issues we've had with tools that we've been reviewing recently is that officers are reluctant to mark reds and negatives on their decision forms. That doesn't help to create the story. An awful lot of their work within proposals is narrative driven, and if you've got reds coming up, that really can, in their opinion, damage their narrative. We would potentially argue that actually that more embeds it in the real world. And then the 6th is about fostering resilience to challenge and criticism. I'm sure anyone who's been living in Manchester and still sees the signs for the clear air zone is well aware of the kind of resistance that we are seeing around these issues. And I think actually an awful lot of the policies and the processes that we will be going through may well be controversial, particularly with a certain type of person. So building resilience within the organisation to that backlash or that social media outrage is a really key part of creating and maintaining this momentum. So thanks for listening. Any questions I'd love to take either on the work itself through the papers or on the process we've done about it and how to work with governmental figures as well. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was really, really interesting, and really extremely relevant, actually timely, given that Donald Trump rescinded the congestion charge in New York yesterday, I think. I don't know enough about American politics to know if it's legal or not, but we have a question from Lucy, who asks if these tools align with other city or jurisdiction reporting. For example, CDP also asks questions on co-benefits, but it's lighter touch than this.
Yeah, so the way we designed it with Manchester and London is we aligned it with their language and their processes that were already in place. We generally found in existing reporting, particularly on the climate side, wasn't of a sufficient standard potentially, as in the bit that was different was it was all self-assessed rather than that self-reported element. So there was no kind of it very much relied on the individual writing the proposal or decision, and then the person marking that to have the required expertise to be able to go, actually, no, there's a consequence there for resilience measures, or oh no, there's this might say it's a transportation thing. This might actually negatively impact how another road is used and increase emissions for 3 years, but then they'll decrease. We needed to include those kind of questions and that kind of thinking, without the massive cost of training those people, basically, if that makes sense. And I see your follow-up question on monetization. By monetization, are you just, I'm not 100% what you're talking to, so feel free to clarify in the comments, but thinking about the economy and the local economy was one of those impact areas.
Brilliant thing. I'll give Lucy may be able to come back on that, but I'd just like to ask about how suitable is this tool for councils at different scales? So I think one thing that I noticed, I used to live in Cornwall, and there was a lot of sort of quite active parish councils that were declaring emergencies, climate emergencies, all the way up to something like GMCA or WECA or GLA.
Mm-hmm.
Does this tool have like use for really small applications as well as the really big ones?
Yeah, it's designed to be used across all scales. The way it works is kind of you activate the parts of it that you need to use. So each individual section you can say, actually, no, that's not relevant to my process. Particularly the impact area questions are very, very applicable. Sometimes the carbon assessment ones are a little bit harder, particularly on more strategy-based decision papers. But yes, no, it's been used by councils across the scales across the UK now.
Great. And then just another sort of connected question is there any potential for this to be adapted for international use of other countries and of different jurisdictions, probably all sorts of complexities, but
yes, if they want to work with us. I think the way that this really came out of that work with GMCA, in that this is what would be interesting to them, what would help them make those kind of changes, and that would stimulate that climate action in their work. And then it kind of snowballed from there. We weren't intending on like creating a tool for lots of people to use. It was much more working on this very specific problem. So potentially it's something we've got some researchers also in Tyndall looking at different cities and how those work. So who knows in the future? But yeah, I don't see why not. If it's of interest and of use, I don't want to push something that's not useful. You know, I want the climate action happens.
Connected actually is a question just coming from Chris, following from Lucy's question. Have you thought about commercialization of the tool?
So the tool is available free for use under a Creative Commons license for any local authority who wants to use it. I should have put the web address up, but we're pretty determined that we don't want to make money off this. We just want people to use it and make the changes.
Is the address cast.ac.uk?
Cast.co.uk, or I'll just look it up for you. Give me a second. cast.ac.uk, and within that you can get to the tool and you can access it as well.
That's brilliant, thanks. And just to answer Esther in the chat there, this will be uploaded onto YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it back. But yeah, thank you to both speakers. We're probably coming towards the end now. Two really interesting areas and really, really relevant, really timely. To remind everyone that we have another one of these, it's on the 24th of April. It's themed around biodiversity and it's in person. So do keep an eye out on our website for, the Eventbrite is there. Alex just posted the Eventbrite in the chat there. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be some biscuits or something available. There normally is. And also, further to that, we do have other events going on over the next few months. We've got a few related to nature, in coordination with the University of Manchester Sustainability Squad, and a few other events. So just check out our events page. It's also listed there in the chat. And Chris, thanks for that. That's the link to the tool there in the chat as well. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay out of the rain. And thank you both for your talks. Really interesting. Thank you.